Welcome to SciTech Gen. Today, we're diving deep into a question that's probably crossed your mind if you've ever gotten or even just thought about getting a tattoo. Can they actually cause cancer? We're going to unpack the science behind it all, and believe it or not, it all kicks off with a pretty wild story about a rock legend and a very unique tribute. So, get this. Earlier this year, Metallica's James Hetfield got this awesome tattoo, an ace of spades on his middle finger, to honor his hero, the legendary Lemmy from Motorhead. But what makes this story really stand out is what was in the ink. It was mixed with a little bit of Lemmy's actual ashes. And as wild as that sounds, these so-called cremation tattoos are actually more common than you might think. But this kind of super personal tribute really shines a spotlight on a much bigger issue, you know? There's almost no one watching over what actually goes into tattooing. Which brings us right to the heart of this explainer. What are we really putting under our skin when we get a tattoo? And more importantly, could any of it be harmful? Okay, so to kick off our investigation, let's look at the first big piece of this puzzle, the completely unregulated world of tattoo ink. Now, what's really fascinating here is the massive difference you see around the world. Back in 2022, Europe actually stepped in. They put limits on thousands of chemicals that were commonly being found in tattoo inks because of health concerns. But in the United States, and frankly, most of the rest of the world, it's a totally different ballgame. There are just no such restrictions. So basically anything, from human ashes to industrial-grade pigments, can potentially end up in the mix. So if the ink itself isn't really regulated, that leads to the next big question. Once it's in you, where does it actually go? Does it just stay put? To answer that, we have to talk about something called your lymph nodes. Just think of these as your body's little security checkpoints or its own internal filtration system. They're these small, bean-shaped organs, and they're a huge part of your immune system, designed specifically to catch and filter out junk the body doesn't want. And this illustration shows exactly what happens. See, when you get a tattoo, your body sees those ink particles as foreign invaders. So your immune system fires up, and some of those tiny ink particles get whisked away from your skin and travel through your lymphatic system. And here is the proof. This is a real human lymph node, and it is stained completely black from all the tattoo ink it's collected over time. So the ink doesn't just fade away into nothing, it literally travels and sets up camp in these really crucial parts of your immune system pretty much for life. So what if scientists actually found hiding in that ink that's built up? Well, some of the ingredients are a little troubling. We're talking about heavy metals like chromium and cadmium, often used to make colors really pop. They've also found chemicals called PAHs, which you might find in stuff like soot or tar. And some of these chemicals, well, they've been flagged by major health organizations as possibly causing cancer in humans. Okay, so you've got these potentially harmful chemicals building up in the body. The next logical step for scientists, of course, was to start hunting for a direct link. So what does the evidence from human studies actually tell us? Well, when researchers looked at skin cancer, the results were kind of all over the place, to be honest. A study in Denmark, it found a higher risk if you had large tattoos. One in Sweden pointed towards a higher risk of melanoma. But then, and this is a real head-scratcher, a study from Utah suggested that having multiple large tattoos might actually protect you against melanoma. I mean, what do you even do with that? It's a completely conflicting picture. And it's not surprising that a lot of these studies face some heavy criticism from other scientists. For example, one dermatologist pointed out a huge flaw in that Danish study, basically saying they lumped different kinds of skin cancer together, which in his words is something you never do in this kind of research. It just goes to show how new and debated this whole field is. But the story does get a little more consistent when we start looking at lymphoma. That's a cancer of the lymphatic system, where the ink collects. A major study out of Sweden found that having a tattoo was linked with about a 20% higher risk of developing lymphoma, and that was even after they adjusted for other major risk factors like smoking or age. So, while the human data is still being argued over, a pretty recent animal study just added a fascinating new piece to this whole puzzle. It might just give us the biological clue for how a tattoo could possibly influence cancer risk. And the story of how they found it is actually pretty cool. The scientists weren't even studying cancer. They were just trying to find a kinder, gentler way to tell their lab mice apart instead of using these heavy clips on their ears. So they decided to try tattooing their tiny little feet. And what they found was a total surprise. The mice with the tattoos developed these super swollen lymph nodes just packed with ink. So they dug a little deeper, and they found that the tattoos seemed to be causing a low-grade but chronic, meaning long-term, inflammation. It also seemed to weaken the local immune response right there. Now, why is that a big deal? Well, because scientists have known for a long, long time that chronic inflammation can be a major risk factor for developing cancer down the line.
All right, we have covered a ton of ground. So let's take a breath and put all these pieces together to see what we really know as of right now.
Okay, let's break it all down. What have we learned? First and foremost, and this is super important, there is no conclusive slam dunk proof that tattoos cause cancer. But we do know that tattoo ink, particularly in the US, is largely unregulated and can contain some potentially nasty chemicals. We also know for a fact that this ink travels and builds up in your lymph nodes. And while some human studies hint at a link to lymphoma, that connection is still very much up for debate. And finally, that mouse study gives us a potential mechanism, a plausible how, through this idea of chronic inflammation. You know, I think this quote from Rachel McCarty, a scientist at the International Agency for Research on Cancer, just sums it up perfectly. She says there's a biological plausibility, meaning, yeah, it's scientifically possible, but she follows it up with there is still so much unknown. And that's really the key. The goal here isn't to scare anyone. It's just about having the information to make your own informed decisions. So we've learned that the permanence of a tattoo isn't just skin deep, is it? It actually becomes a long-term resident inside your immune system. That's all we have for this explainer. Thank you so much for tuning in to SciTech Gen. And we'll leave you with one final thought. Knowing that this science is still unfolding, how does this change the way you think about what permanent really means when it comes to tattoos?